Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panelists, Mr. Giselle and Ms. Allison, to today's webinar. In addition to this, I would like to say thank you, everyone, for joining our DCVMN members and also community leaders and LinkedIn followers for today's webinar with B Medical Systems. My name is Tamires, and today I will be hosting the webinar from B Medical Systems with the topic of Sustainable Medical Cold Chain, the need of the hour for last mile vaccine potency. We will have a 45 minutes presentation from Mr. Giselle, and then we will proceed with the Q&A session with 15 minutes. Everyone is invited to pose the questions in the Q&A button just on the bottom of your screen. If you encounter any technical difficulties, you can contact me on email or you can go to the chat button, pin myself, and I will be very glad to support you. I also kindly remind you that this webinar is being recorded as authorized by B Medical Systems, and all the materials, including this PPT presentation, will be available on the CVMN's website until tomorrow. So now, let me introduce our high-level speaker from today, Mr. Giselle Doshi. Mr. Giselle Doshi, Deputy CEO of B Medical Systems, possesses a wealth of knowledge in medical cold chain, private equity, and corporate strategy. Mr. Doshi has developed and implemented several initiatives that transform B Medical Systems from a regional player into a leading global player. He is also the CEO of B Medical Systems India and played a critical role in the company's establishment of a multi-million subsidiary in India. If you would like to connect with him, you can scan the QR code in your screen and then you can ask him to be his follower on LinkedIn. So now, Mr. Doshi, I will hand it over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tamires, and thank you to the DCVMN team for inviting me to be a host speaker on this. It's truly an honor to speak to such a distinguished audience. And I would like to talk a little bit about the sustainability as well as a medical cold chain. I promise that I will keep the bit about the company very brief and really try and spread as much knowledge as possible as opposed to talking about my organization. Having that said, I'd like to just show a quick video about B Medical Systems and then we'll get right into the topic.
Dear friend, do you see this man?
So just very quickly, B Medical Systems, as you would have seen, we are the world's oldest and the world's largest company focused purely on the medical coaching. And with that, we help store and transport vaccines, blood and its constituents like plasma and platelets, and also many other temperature sensitive pharmaceutical products like oxytocin and insulin. And we do this all over the world in practically every country. In addition to this, and I think something that is a matter of great pride for us, is we are one of the first companies to have actually set up manufacturing in the global south. And so, of course, we do have always been present in Luxembourg, where we have a very large manufacturing facility. But today, we also have invested millions of dollars in setting up a state-of-the-art facility in India. So that's a little bit about B Medical. And as promised, I will now talk about a very interesting topic. So talking about the macro level, everybody today, especially this group, does not need any preaching about the value of immunization. I think today we all know, and it's a globally accepted fact, that immunization is the best investment that one can ever make in healthcare. You get a return of $54 for every dollar spent in immunization. Despite this, unfortunately, the chart that you see on the left is the global coverage of immunization as measured by coverage of some basic vaccines. So 3 doses of diphtheria, tetanus, and so the DTP3 vaccine. And as you can see, of course, there was a COVID slump, and I'm very happy to see that immunization has recovered since then. But you do see over the last several years, you do see a plateau, and we've never really been able to go above 90% global immunization for a wide variety of factors. One of the biggest factors is the inability to reach the last mile. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So in order to improve the last mile coverage, we need to improve last mile vaccine potency. And why is that important? Because in many places, when you talk about the last mile, yes, you are still able to get kids or vaccines to children as well as adults who need them, but the potency is lacking because you don't have the right cold chain. And that is indeed one of the biggest problems facing us today as we look at improving immunization coverage. Now, what is essential to ensure last mile vaccine potency is sustainability. And sustainability for me has 2 different elements. One is a programmatic element, and the other, which today is incredibly important, is an environmental element in terms of being environmentally sustainable while reaching the remotest last mile on Earth. So let me talk a little bit first about programmatic sustainability and what are some of the challenges that exist today when it comes to programmatic sustainability. The first and by far the largest challenge is unreliable electricity. Today, there are about 1 billion people on Earth who do not have access, do not have access to stable electricity supply. And as you can see on the left, a large chunk of it is in Africa. However, you do have a large chunk also in South Asia, where people do not have continuous access to reliable electricity. 15% in sub-Saharan African health facilities do not have any access to electricity. And again, in South Asia, you see the number is about 12%, which is much higher than what one would expect. So that's challenge number 1. The second challenge linked to electricity, of course, closely interrelated, is logistical challenges. And this is a very interesting chart, which shows you the coverage of immunization against COVID plotted against the logistics performance index. So as you can see, you see a lot of poor performers where less than 10% of the population has been fully vaccinated. This is just incredible. What is even more astonishing is the colors. You see a light blue circle and a dark blue circle. And the dark blue circles are countries where they had actually destroyed or given away vaccines because they were unable to administer them. And so they lost, either they reached their expiry date or they did not have the right cold chain conditions. So this just tells you very starkly the state of the remotest last mile in many countries around the world and the direct impact that it has had on immunization. The third challenge to sustainability, to programmatic sustainability, and I'm sure this is a challenge that is faced in many parts of the developing world, is not having enough knowledge about all the costs associated, A, with immunization, but here specifically also when you talk about cold chain equipment. Typically, a lot of countries or governments look at the upfront procurement cost of buying a piece of cold chain equipment. What they do not realize is there are significant costs associated which they will incur over the lifetime of that equipment. Maintenance, for example, availability of spare parts. Just to give you an example, if a vaccine cold chain unit in Afghanistan gets spoiled, the cost to actually send somebody there, analyze the problem, then get a spare part sent there and fix it is actually way higher than the cost of the unit itself. So these are, of course, this is an extreme example, but there are indeed many, many costs. Today, a lot of equipment comes with real-time monitoring, but real-time monitoring too has ongoing recurring costs. The cost of data transmission, cost of data storage, data analysis. So all of these costs need to be captured, which unfortunately do not get captured at all times, creating a lack of sustainability when it comes to programmatic implementation. And the last, of course, and you could see that very starkly in the previous slide, is the cost of spoiled vaccines. Typically, this is something that nobody ever includes, but this is indeed a huge hidden cost, both in terms of the money, but as well as the fact that you could have vaccinated somebody who needed that vaccine, but unfortunately could not because the vaccine was spoiled. So these are three big programmatic challenges that exist. Now, moving on to environmental sustainability. So UNICEF very recently did a study on estimating the total emissions for delivering immunization programs globally. It's a fantastic study, and I encourage each and every one of you all to go through that. But they came out with some pretty stark numbers. If you look at the environmental impact of immunization globally, it's 350,000 tons of CO2, which is fairly large. And just to put it in terms of a perspective that we can all understand, it's the annual equivalent of 226,000 passengers flying from Dubai to New York. So again, this also raises a big question on emissions of airlines, which is a totally different topic, something I'm very passionate about, but that's for a different discussion. Now, so in addition to environmental complexity and programmatic complexity that I spoke about, the reality also is that this cold chain is extremely complex. And here I've tried to articulate the journey a typical vaccine will make, starting from a supplier, which could be located in any part of the world, which provides the raw materials to a vaccine manufacturer, who in turn could be located in a different part of the world, from where the vaccines get manufactured and get delivered to warehouses, subsequently to country hubs and to hospitals, but most typically to last mile vaccination spots, which typically exist. I mean, the easiest way to imagine that is a village of a few hundred people where you still have children who need to get vaccinated. Now, all along this, you have different stakeholders, you have different forms of transportation, you have different external operating conditions. You could be, for example, in the desert where a vaccine has to be sent, but it has to be sent, let's say, from Belgium in winter when it's -5 degrees, and then ultimately it reaches a spot where it's +43 degrees. So how do you manage the cold chain through all of these is really critical, and it's typically the last mile where, unfortunately, potency is most commonly lost. Also, if the cold chain is not managed properly, it can create significant wastage, health issues, as well as an environmental impact. And I'll just quickly go through each one of those. So in terms of wastage, I think, again, these numbers are well known. Globally, the estimate of temperature-sensitive farmers that have been scrapped due to logistics issues is about 30%, which translates to $35 billion. And of course, it also means that 25% of the vaccines are reaching the final destination in a somewhat less potent form or after having lost their potency. Of course, there are many critical health issues. These are just two examples. Recently, I read of another example in the US where where there was a center storing a lot of very valuable research samples at minus 80 degrees Celsius, and they were all lost, causing millions of dollars of loss, but more importantly, loss of specimens which you'll never be able to recover again. And again, we spoke broadly about the cold chain and emissions for immunization, but here you can get a little bit more detail about the exact environmental impact of cold chain. So cold chain contributes about 32% of the overall impact of immunization. So it is a fairly large number. And again, this is articulated in great detail with UNICEF in their report. So this is something that I think is really critical that we must, all of us must look at. Again, when you think about the different elements here, we are starting off with production, and here production of cold chain equipment contributes or is about 37% is associated with production of cold chain equipment. So it is a fairly large number. On the transport side, while it contributes 27% overall, the impact that they consider with cold chain is only 0.4%, which for me represents a somewhat of an underestimation, because in many countries today, the cold chain transportation element is highly suboptimal. And there are many issues there which are not being considered today when you look at global immunization. In many cases, the transportation itself creates a significant source of emission. And so this is an area where I personally feel we need to do a lot more work into. When you look at the operations piece, so this is the operations of immunization across the world. And all of this is attributable to cold chain equipment. And here again, you're dealing with a wide variety of cold chain equipment, a wide variety of temperatures with regards to cold chain equipment. And so there are many different complexities involved here. For example, you have legacy cold chain equipment in many parts of the world, which, believe it or not, even today work on kerosene as their energy source. And we all know that kerosene is highly, highly harmful for the environment. But due to a wide variety of reasons, they continue to exist in several parts of the world. Of course, it's not easy to replace all of the equipment in one shot. So there are many other factors as well involved in the continual usage of such legacy equipment. In addition to that, when you think about waste disposal, and again, here I think the number is underestimated. So today, the waste disposal associated with immunization is typically the wastage considered with discarded syringes and needles. Of course, I think that indeed is a huge problem, and we have to look at ways to tackle that, especially as we start looking at auto-disposable syringes and so on. But cold chain itself is also a problem. If you think about a place like, again, let's say Congo or the Amazon forest in Brazil, you have a piece of equipment which has been working, let's say, for 10 or 15 years. And after that needs to be disposed. Unfortunately, today, in most parts of the world, the disposal is not done correctly. It continues to be used beyond its useful life, which again has many environmental implications. So again, there are many different aspects here that one needs to look into a lot of detail. But this, for me, is a very interesting chart because it captures the entire carbon life cycle of an immunization campaign. And again, for this group, I think this is extremely relevant to see how we could try and work on each and every aspect of this, not just the cold chain. Just moving on, when you think about the cold chain and the environmental impact caused by cold chain, so there are typically two of the largest causes are what we call direct emissions and indirect emissions. I think the reason I included this is because for all of you all, this is very important to understand. The 30% of global cold chain related emissions which come from refrigerant release. So in the past, I'm sure you would have remembered there was a lot of talk about ozone depletion. And so fortunately, the world many years ago has moved away from the usage of refrigerants which deplete the ozone layer. However, there are different types of refrigerants, and those earliest refrigerants were known as HCFCs, which is hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which had tremendous destructive destructive effect on the ozone layer. Since then, many years ago, HCFCs have been banned. The world post that moved on to HFCs, which is hydrofluorocarbons. And one of the most common refrigerant using HFC is R134A, for example. Again, it's significantly better than the HCFCs, but it has significant contribution to greenhouse gas and so to carbon dioxide emissions. Therefore, some years ago, the world decided that, not the world rather, but many people came together, many countries came together and decided that over time they would phase out the use of HFC refrigerants like R134A. And so today the gold standard that is being used is simply HCs, which is hydrocarbons. So these are 100% naturally occurring. The complication with them is that they are flammable in nature. So the way you treat them, the way you manufacture using HCs in your manufacturing facility is different. One of the biggest issues that you face, for example, is in cases of emergency, you cannot air freight a unit which has hydrocarbons. And so, of course, during COVID, that meant that a lot of units that were sent by air did not have hydrocarbons, but HFCs. But I think this is a very important element that we need to keep in mind, and we need to focus on reducing it. So if I had one key takeaway for all of you all, when you all are looking at planning your supply chain, I would strongly urge you to not look at HFCs, but to look at cold chain using hydrocarbons only. And the other one, of course, is the indirect emissions related to energy consumption. So a refrigeration by most, so you have active and passive cold chain units. Active units are ones which use refrigeration or some form of refrigeration. And passive units are ones which do not require any external refrigeration. So passive example of a passive cold chain is typically a transport box where you would put in ice packs or PCM packs or gel packs. And the PCM or the gel packs have the cold to actually keep the vaccines or any other product cold. So that's passive. Of course, there is still, you need to cool those PCMs, which is where the electricity consumption comes in. But for an active unit which works on an energy source, there is, of course, a cost associated to creating that energy. And I will get into subsequent detail about how we could even reduce the 70% of the cold chain emissions to almost zero. So again, to put it more graphically, when we started off, we had HCFCs. And here I've given a few examples of different refrigerants, which have the different, and on the leftmost, you see carbon dioxide, which is treated commonly as 1 GWP. And then the other refrigerants are measured in terms of the impact they have in terms of one carbon dioxide GWP. So for example, one of the earliest refrigerants being used was CFC12, which has 10,900 times the environmental impact of carbon dioxide. So you can simply imagine the kind of massive impact it has compared to carbon dioxide. On the left, you see R404A, which was also still very commonly used, unfortunately, which has nearly 4,000 times the environmental impact of carbon dioxide. And then you have 134A, which has about 1,500 times the global warming potential of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So again, this I think makes it very interesting because it shows you graphically the kind of destructive element or the destructive impact that some of these refrigerants have, which unfortunately is invisible to us, but it does have a significant impact. And therefore, my urge to you to stop using HFCs and only look at HCs. All HCs, by the way, the impact is zero from a GWP perspective. So with sort of this broad context, I wanted to talk about the problem that exists. What are some of the challenges that exist, both environmentally and programmatically? And also talk a little bit about not necessarily what a B medical product can do, but really what a sustainable medical cold chain can do. And I think this is of high relevance to each and every one of you. So it's purely from that perspective that I've used B medical systems as a representative example. But of course, we are not the only ones who are doing this. There are many other great companies with great products out there. And I would urge you to think about this as championing each and every one of those which stands for sustainability and ensuring a reliable cold chain in the medical space. So the first problem with regards to electricity, when you think about electricity today, there exists a wide variety of solutions that work purely using solar power. These are incredible solutions that can work in pretty much every part of the world where you don't need any electricity. They work purely on solar energy. And most importantly, one of the commonest questions that I get asked when I talk about SDDs, as they are known, which is solar direct drives, is how do you store energy? There is absolutely no battery in these units. That's why it's called a solar direct drive unit, because these units typically use the solar power and convert it directly to cold in the form of ice, which means that you are not keeping an intermediate battery to store power, but really converting it straight away into cold. And then it's that cold which is stored in the form of ice, which maintains the temperature of typically 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, or in some cases, minus 20 degrees Celsius. In some extreme cases, we also have units which work at minus 80 degrees Celsius and are powered entirely by solar energy. So this is, I think, a great example. Again, as I said, it doesn't have to be medical. There are many companies, but this is a fantastic solution that has helped bring access for temperature sensitive medical commodities to the very last mile in many parts of the world. Here, this is a fantastic image. So this is a real image from the Amazon forest in Brazil, where we have installed some of our products. And again, what you see here is, this is a solar direct drive unit. It also has a freezer and a refrigerator. So you can store different kinds of products in those two different areas. What is absolutely important to understand is to make sure that not only are they energy efficient, but they are also extremely robust and reliable. As I mentioned earlier, if one of these units breaks down, it can be an incredible challenge to go and fix a unit like this. Therefore, I think to have reliability and how can you ensure whether a certain product is reliable or not? I think, of course, when you look visually at a product, this is a product that looks like it's built to last. And the other aspect, of course, is looking for certifications. So there are, many medical device certifications, ISO 13485, for example. In several countries, vaccine cold chain is considered a medical device. In several countries, blood cold chain is considered a medical device. And typically, these are guarantees that, a certain device which has a certification will have a certain level of performance, reliability, and durability. Of course, WHO has its own standards as well, which is known as the PQS, as I'm sure you're all aware of. And they do also have fairly robust tests to ensure whether or not a piece of equipment is WHO PQS certified or not. Again, to give you some more pictorial examples, it's also not just the storage of a stationary fridge, it's also the transportation element. And how do you ensure transportation is also maintaining the absolute right cold chain? Again, I think, there are many different solutions out there, but again, the test is, are these certified? Are these certified medical devices? Where have they been used? in the past. And so you can get a simple picnic box, which can be, or beer box, which can be used for, which is used for beer. Unfortunately, in many countries, in many places, they use it also for vaccines, which is not the right thing to do. But I believe we are getting much better on this, and we are getting more and more, we're getting a much deeper understanding of the regulatory framework and the certifications that exist. This, I think, is something that I'd like to spend a bit more time on, because I really believe this is the future. So we are talking about real-time monitoring here. And of course, this is real-time monitoring has become increasingly important for many legs of a vaccine's transportation journey, but it's typically almost always still the first mile. And I think now we have the ability to actually, with real-time remote monitoring, ensure the traceability of a vaccine or a blood sample all the way from its point of origin till the point it is administered to a recipient. So I think this is fantastic. We have, just us as B Medical, we have more than 100,000 units all across the world, which provide us with real-time information. And there's also a lot of analytics. So in many places of the world, we've had some incredible examples. And to give you one anecdotal example, we were observing closely the vaccine cold chain network in Afghanistan. And what we observed was the time when the Taliban took over. Post that, the usage of the vaccine cold chain went up almost 5 times. And this for us was incredibly powerful, because sitting anywhere in the world, you could have visibility into a part of the world where you could not obviously access at that point of time, but you could see that there was something being done well, and incredibly well at that. And we continue seeing that till today, by the way. So we do see the positive impact, and this is a great example of the direct correlation between vaccination and public health, which is not really evident using such data in specific scenarios. In addition to the real-time aspect, so which means that you could see, for example, real-time where a certain batch of vaccines is on its journey, what was the temperature history of it, what is the journey that it is going to make, and you can get a fully certified report at the end of the journey, thereby ensuring that as a vaccine manufacturer, you have got full traceability, that from the time the vaccine left your manufacturing facility till the time it was administered, it was stored at the right temperatures. And therefore, I think it acts as a measure, as a safeguard for vaccine potency, and gives also the recipient the full guarantee. As an example of this, in India, to give you one example, we had worked with Dr. Reddy's Limited, which had introduced a Sputnik vaccine in India, which, as you would know, required a cold chain of -20 degrees Celsius and below. And we had provided them a countrywide cold chain where they could analyze at any point of time the status of the cold chain anywhere in the country. Of course, since then, there's been a lot of evolution in this space. Today, real-time data analytics, predictive analytics is being worked on. So, for example, in the case of a solar unit, the commonest source of failure that happens with a solar-powered unit is that solar panels have not been cleaned. Now, this is not a manufacturing defect. It's something that needs to be done on a periodic basis. But in many parts of the world, people do not do that. Now, with the predictive analytics, instead of sending somebody to a corner of Madagascar and only to find out that the panels were not cleaned and the unit otherwise was working perfectly, we now have the ability to predictively diagnose using real-time data and using machine analytics that the solar panels have not been cleaned. So in a scenario like this, what we do today is we simply send out an automated SMS and an email to the health center worker in Madagascar saying, please clean your panels. What happens, just to complete this example, is the person would come back saying, yes, I've cleaned the panels, and nothing would have actually happened. In that scenario, we can already diagnose again that no, the panels have not been cleaned. And so we go back and we send a second alert. To give you another example, in many parts, what happens is the solar panels the orientation of the panels need to be changed during different times of the year to match the area of maximum sunlight. And again, this is something that historically would be very challenging to do. Today, we have analytics to show us that, yes, these solar panels are not receiving the right amount of sunlight. And knowing the precise GPS location of that particular health center, we would be able to instruct the team at the health center to modify the position of the solar panels, which is literally a 5-minute operation. So again, these are very, very valuable initiatives that help in significantly reducing the operations cost, the maintenance cost, and thereby improving the programmatic sustainability of such immunization campaigns. So that's a little bit from my side. I believe I have finished a little ahead of time. But again, these images are fantastic because vaccines, everybody believes that vaccines save lives. But at the end of the day, it's not vaccines, but it's a vaccination that saves lives. And there is a big difference there because the fantastic work done by all the vaccine manufacturers would not be creating that incredible an outcome had it not been for the right cold chain to ensure the potency of the vaccine all the way till each and every kid and adult who needs it receives it on the planet. So with that, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your attention. That's just a little bit about us. If in case you would like to get in touch with us, we are present in Luxembourg, where we have nearly 300 employees, in India, where we have over 100 employees, and also in the United States. And of course, I would love to meet all of you all in Cape Town, and I'm really looking forward to that engagement. So I look forward to meeting you all and also hopefully having an interesting Q&A right now. Tamirez, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Giselle, for this interactive and complete presentation. We have some questions from the attendees, of course, and we hope that some of them and also our DCVMN members are able to meet you and at the AGM and also visit your booth there. So we have the first question from Ambrose, which says, could you throw some light on Peltier cooling? Do you have any equipment using this technology?
So great question, Ambrose. So Peltier cooling, or thermoelectric cooling as it's known, is a different kind of cooling, which does not require a typical compressor, as you would know. We used to have Peltier-based cooling systems many years ago, and I'm talking at least more than 10 years ago. And we used to supply them primarily to the armed forces. So we supplied a lot to NATO armies for transporting blood bags to the front lines. And the big advantage of this cooling technology is you don't need to have a compressor. And so from a design perspective, gives you a lot more flexibility. The big challenge with Peltier technology is the efficiency of the technology. So ultimately, like any other technology, it requires an energy input, and then it converts that energy into cold using thermoelectrics. The efficiency of that conversion is not that great. And since I'm talking now over the last 5-7 years, a lot of progress has indeed been made on this technology. So now there are cooling solutions using Peltier. But even if you look at the best Peltier cooling-based solution, the volume that it can keep cold is typically less than 10 liters. So Peltier is a great technology for last mile, where you need less than 10 liters of vaccine storage. As of today, I believe, as with technology, there's a lot of work going on. And so I'm very hopeful that in the future, you will have larger volume applications using Peltier technology. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Ambrose, for your question. And thank you, Mr. Chazal, for answering it. We have a comment from Almas, which says, thank you for this wonderful presentation, examples and pictures. It was very informative indeed. These materials will be available on the CVMN's website. Thank you for the compliment. And Almas also posed a question. Hello, are the RTMDs incorporated into the CCE or on the vaccine vial? If it's only on the CCEs, we know that temperature is maintained in the STD, but how are we ensuring that vaccines taken for our outreach vaccine carriers are temperature-controlled settings? Do we have similar vaccine carriers, solar-driven or with RTMDs?
So fantastic question, Almas. And I think so to answer your first question, the RTMD is incorporated into the cold chain equipment. So if you think about a SDD, it's the SDD itself which has RTMD on it. Of course, for vaccines and vaccine vials, you have vaccine vial monitors, which is not real time, but it's a label that changes color if, in very simplistic terms, a label that changes color if the right temperature has not been maintained. Now, to answer your second question, and this is a great question, and I'm very glad that you asked this, because it's typically the absolute last mile where the cold chain gets broken. So it's not even the SDD, which already is fairly remote, but from the SDD, when you go to immunize children in a school, for example, in an outreach campaign, and you take them in a vaccine carrier, that's where the cold chain outages or breakages happen. So today, we do have technology to monitor also vaccine carriers using real-time monitoring. And I think that's increasingly where we see the world going, because everybody understands and acknowledges that it's the weakest point and we need to do something about it. So yes, we do have vaccine carriers with RTMDs, which are not solar powered. The RTMDs today with typically are battery powered, but with the kind of battery technology advancements in battery technology, you have RTMDs that can last for a minimum of 5 years without changing batteries. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Almas, for your question. If you still have more comments on this, please. We still have time for you to address this in the Q&A button. So you already mentioned something about it, but we have a question from Salmendra. And the question is, how temperature is maintained in vaccine carrier?
So in a vaccine carrier, you have typically, I would say the historical conventional way of a vaccine carrier is it's typically an ice box. So it's a box which is made specifically for vaccines, and you put ice packs which have been frozen at ideally at -20 degrees Celsius, and then conditioned. So what conditioned means is that you need to remove them from the freezer and keep them out for a few minutes before you keep them inside the box. Otherwise, if you put them directly, the vaccines would freeze. So that's the kind of historical way of doing it, which is putting ice packs. Now, the obvious question and one would ask is, yes, but what if somebody put them directly by mistake? Would the vaccines not freeze and therefore lose their potency? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that is what was happening in many parts of the world. So today you have something known as a freeze-free vaccine carrier, where a user can simply remove a frozen ice pack and put it inside a box. But the box has been constructed in a way that even if you put an ice pack at -20 or -30 degrees, the vaccines will not freeze, which is why it's called a freeze-free vaccine carrier. So that's one large, and I would say this accounts for, in public immunization in the developing countries, this accounts for 95%. The vaccine carrier and the freeze-free vaccine carrier accounts for more than 95% of immunization. The balance 5%, and perhaps even lesser, is done through active cooling. So it could be thermoelectric or Peltier cooling, and also sometimes a refrigerated van, for example. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much for your question. Feel free also to contact Mr. Giselle on LinkedIn and also through email to have more details on these questions. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. What is the capacity of the solar power equipment, nominal size? And what is the validation period for +2 to +8 Celsius degree? How long it keeps at this temperature?
Great. So solar powered equipment typically starts in terms of capacity from about 10 liters of vaccine storage to almost, I would say, 300 liters. So that's the kind of range, and you have different equipment for different sizes. The validation period for 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, and I'll explain this using the WHO PQS methodology. So WHO PQS calls, or there's a term known as autonomy or holdover, which basically means for how long can a certain equipment maintain 2 to 8 degrees Celsius in the absence of any power source. And in the case of solar powered equipment, the power source is the sun, which basically means what happens at night, when you don't have sun. And so that's the way to measure it. So on average, any of these pieces of equipment can maintain 2 to 8 degrees when the external temperature is plus 43 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 4 days, which means that, for 4 continuous 24-hour periods, you have zero sunlight, and it's still 43 degrees outside, which theoretically seems very impossible, but that's just for the sake of ensuring additional safeguards. In that scenario, you'll be maintaining it for a minimum of 4 days. We do have equipment that goes all the way up to 1 month. So you can have 1 month of 2 to 8 degrees without any power source whatsoever.
Thank you for clarifying this. And thank you for the question. It was a very smart one. So Ambrose also would like to understand how well are the cold chain equipment maintained at places around the world? Some comments from your side.
It's a very difficult question, a very tricky one as well, Ambrose. But so I would say my sort of macro comment, significantly better than it was 5 years ago, and almost in every part of the world. And in addition to that, I would say that the big change that has come with cold chain equipment is real-time monitoring. And that is really, as an organization, we have been doing it for almost 10 years now, but it has really picked up pace during the pandemic, because during the pandemic, a lot of vaccines, COVID vaccines, were a lot more valuable, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of scarcity. Just to give you a simple example, if a polio vaccine got spoiled somewhere, not too many people would bother about it. But during the pandemic, and at the height of the pandemic, when vaccines were incredibly scarce, if a small batch of COVID vaccines got spoiled, it did have significant repercussions. And I think that brought in the mindset change that, hey, we cannot ignore the cold chain. We need to think about the cold chain, and therefore the importance of real-time monitoring. So to come back to your question, I would say much better than what it was. Is there still scope for improvement? Absolutely. I think the last mile where vaccine carriers are, today less than 1% of vaccine carriers have monitoring. So I think there is a huge amount of improvement to be done, especially at the last mile.
Thank you very much for your overview on this, and thank you, Ambrose, for your question. So somebody said, wow, thank you for that, and it's really too long period. This makes reference to the previous question that you answered. Thank you very much. So we have a question from Hugo Agostino. And the question is, how would you compare the level of maintenance between Western countries and developing countries?
So very interesting question. And I think one of the big learnings during the pandemic was many countries, many Western countries had absolutely no idea about how to go about immunization for COVID. Because in a lot of these countries, if you look at Western Europe or the US, immunization is not done at a national level for children, right? So you don't have a mass immunization campaign, which means that you don't have any infrastructure to actually implement immunization at that scale. Now, having that said, you're coming back to your question specifically around maintenance. I would say immunization, with the exception of COVID, is largely a government-sponsored subject in developing countries and mostly a private sector subject in developed countries. In the US, for example, you could go to a Walmart and get a vaccine, which would not happen in many parts of the developing world. Now, in the Western countries, I would say the level of maintenance historically has been poor to average. And this is the shocking revelation which came about during the pandemic, because nobody really thought about having the right quality equipment. A Walmart, for example, in the US would typically have a domestic household refrigerator in which they would keep vaccines at the back of the pharmacy where nobody could see them. And so I think now they are also looking at remote monitoring. They are looking at improving that. Whereas in a developing country, because it was typically the Ministry of Health in charge of it, there was over the last few years, and increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, a much better level of maintenance for the public cold chain, vaccine cold chain.
Thank you for your question. Everyone is interested in this difference between Western countries, developing countries, and how this actually works globally. Thank you very much, Hugo, for your question. So thank you. Hugo responded to you. Very interesting findings. Thank you. So we have another question from Vishal. Very interesting session, and using technology to keep track of packaging performance is appreciated. There is a human factor in this entire cycle. How do you manage the training of personnel at the installation locations for them to be able to effectively handle the coolers? Good question.
Yeah, fantastic question, Vishal. And this has been, I would say, a big issue in many countries around the world. And I think it exists at, I would say, at two levels. One is how to operate a piece of equipment, and the other one is what to do if something goes wrong or some sort of maintenance. And in many places around the world, it's the same person who's in charge of both. So I think on the latter, which is the maintenance piece, that's where you try and design equipment which is as maintenance free as possible. And that's something that, one of the things we do, for example, is the single largest protection that your fridge has to keep the cold inside is a gasket. So every fridge will have the door or the lid will have a gasket. And most commonly what happens is the gasket gets torn or wears off. And there, no matter how good the refrigeration unit is, if there is a gap, it will not maintain the cold. So therefore, what we do is we provide additional gaskets for which to install them, you only need to install them with your hands. So you don't really need any training. And so that's a great example of how product innovation and design can help reduce or mitigate the impact of the lack of availability of trained personnel. On running the unit itself, I like to give a real example based on what we've seen. So for solar powered equipment, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenges is that people do not clean the solar panels. So what we did was we introduced a USB socket, which you could use for charging your mobile phones. But we said, look, this will work only when you clean the panels, which meant that because people wanted, I mean, everybody's interested in charging their mobile phone. Not so many people are always interested in ensuring that the cold chain is maintained. But by using that, we were able to effectively increase the maintenance of solar panels dramatically. So I think that's again an example. And of course, the third element is you just need to have incredibly good training programs. And so we do training programs all over the world physically. With COVID, of course, a lot of them were virtual, but we continue to be present in most parts of the world and train people on the ground.
Thank you very much for your question, Michelle, and thank you very much for commenting on this. Very interesting. So we have another comment from Saumendra. Very innovative idea about USB socket. Congratulations for such innovation. Indeed. And
Thank
Vishal, who asked the questions, thanks for the explanation. Thank you for the questions. Everyone, we still have some time for answering more questions, but I have a question that is from the interest of the CVMN members, of course. You already mentioned and addressed this, but we would like to have more details on it. So the question is, you mentioned that solar-powered equipment is key to have sustainable cold chain able to reach the last mile. But how does the equipment maintain the temperature in case of no sunlight?
Yeah, so going back to what I mentioned earlier, the equipment transfers power directly from the solar panels into ice. And you're just getting into a bit of chemistry. So you have phase change materials, which typically change phase at a certain temperature. The best PCM that exists in the world is water, because at 0 degrees Celsius, it becomes ice from water. What happens is the moment it becomes ice, so it takes a long time to become ice. As you would know, when you put water into your ice cube tray, it takes a few hours for it to become ice. But once it becomes ice, it stores a lot of latent cooling power or latent heat or cooling power inside. And so it takes a long time to actually melt away and become water again. And that's how you manage to keep the right temperature for a much longer time. So it's essentially chemistry. Of course, you have one other very important element is insulation, because when you have a source of cold inside something, there are only two ways to keep it cold. A is to maintain the cold, and B is to make sure that no heat from outside comes in. And that's the role of insulation. So I would say fundamentally it's chemistry in the form of phase change materials, but it's also a lot of material sciences when it comes to insulation.
Thank you very much for answering this. We still have other question. Are you seeing adoption of solar-powered devices contributing to carbon emissions reduction in the medical cold chain across the world?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are more and more organizations which are looking at it also from a carbon credit generating perspective. You know, if they were to replace an obsolete set of cold chain equipment with very efficient solar powered cold chain equipment, there is significant benefit in terms of reduction of emissions. And today, you know, the whole world is looking at this. So all the large pharma companies globally are looking at how their supply chain, both in terms of raw materials, but also in terms of their finished products, how can that become much more environmentally friendly? And so I think this is really one important element in that journey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gisal. Unfortunately, our webinar has to be ended as we have already achieved the time. So I would like to thank you, Mr. Gisal, for joining us today, and Ms. Allison as well, and everyone who interactively participated in today's webinar. The recording and this presentation will be available on the CVMN's website by tomorrow. You can access it on the webinar series on the CVMN's website. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please you can contact me on email or LinkedIn if you want. I hope that you can also connect to Mr. Gisal Dosh on LinkedIn, and especially in Cape Town in our 2023 ATM. So thank you very much, everyone, for engaging today, and I hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.